This is Generous Theology, and today Chuck and Brock are taking a look at Professor Black's work in Chapter 23, The Nature of Intellect, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
Speaking of interesting, the nature of the intellect. This has got to be one of the most interesting topics in philosophy. It's very much a human-centered, but it also affects the areas outside of the human because of our ontological relationship with reality. So there's endless room for discussion here. And Deborah Black has authored this chapter that we're looking at. And I think just a survey of the major medieval schools of thought is probably the main focus of things here. And how deep does this go, Chuck? How far down the stack should we question when it comes to this kind of thing in reality? And what was your thought when you were reading the chapter?
As I read the chapter, my first thought in reading was more historical context. There is a lot in this chapter that seems like a lot of what we've read before. Some of the names get repeated. We see Avicenna, Averroes, and how they're dealing with this framework and how it comes to Europe, and the thinkers who had really been this Platonic way of thinking are now introduced through these Islamic thinkers to Aristotle, and then Christian and Jewish thinkers both take these ideas and apply them. And there's a little bit of, some of this makes sense, and then people take it in a certain direction. And there was, I think, comment on Albert the Great, for example, and some of his thoughts, and people getting criticized that maybe to some extent they had taken things too far for Christian philosophy. That whole sort of story, we've seen that in some of the other things that we've read. And so I found it really interesting. A lot of times when you read someone's historical synopsis, you go, well, how much of this is their perception of it and how much of it is really a much wider? Now that we keep hearing this story over and over again, I think there's a sense in which we have a little more faith in people like Black and their presentation of things is, at least if not the truth as in exactly the way it happened, at least it does seem to be a widely accepted interpretation of how much of the intellectual foment of the medieval era took place. And it does seem to make that was part two, was that it is interesting that once again, just as we've had in a few other chapters, we get a sense of that there is really the Aristotelian way of thinking. There was this sense in which it really did have an impact, and it changed the way people thought about, and that led to a little bit of a, hey, okay, we can accept this. There are some things that we see in this view of things that sort of make some sense to us in the way that we perceive the world around us. His arguments seem logical and rational, and yet at times we also see some areas of concern. What does this mean? How do we apply this to Christian thought? And there does seem to be a concern from some during this era that people were taking this Aristotelian view hook, line, and sinker and almost syncretizing it into Christianity in a way that weakens Christian thinking and reliance on sort of scriptural truths. And that's interesting as well, because I think we've seen a little bit of that as well. And I know in some of our discussions, there's certainly things out of the Platonic tradition that as Christians we are critical of. But it does seem that the story of Aristotle and the rediscovery of his thought also had a major impact on Christian thinking, and not always. Sometimes it is in a positive way. You just, as we've said many times, this general revelation adds a lot to our knowledge, but there are times also where in this, it does seem like it led people down paths that perhaps are not the paths that we would have them go. And so that I found that interesting. Part three was just, okay, I'm trying to read about these different kinds of intellect. There's the agent intellect, potential intellect, which some people call the material intellect, habitual or speculative, the acquired, and just trying to get my mind wrapped around it at times just made me a little dizzy. And whoa, what is really going on here? What does this all mean? And yet a sense in which it does seem on the one hand, yeah, It's like we talked about a few weeks ago. Is it angels dancing on the head of a pin and counting how many angels, or does it really get at some real key ideas? And I think there is a sense in which, do we need every Christian believer spending a lot of their time thinking about these issues? Perhaps not. But do we need to have Christians who are thinking about these issues and understanding them and applying Christian thought to these ideas? Yes, it is very important, because it does have an impact later on sciences like psychology and sociology. How does the intellect work? What is the connection of the intellect to the soul? What is the connection of the intellect to the individual being? All those really do have some pretty important impacts on the way we think about so many things today. So it is an important discussion, even if at times it is a rather deep and difficult.
Yeah, said, I love that introduction here. It is perhaps regrettable that the Middle Ages is all about being the middle. Because of that, we're always reaching back into classical antiquity to talk about these issues. In some sense, the Middle Ages are not so much about originating new ideas, although there are progressions of thought, there are new ideas that come and go. But you always have to open the study by going back and summarizing what came in antiquity. And so this chapter was no different. So if we want to look at what developed in the Middle Ages, we have to set the chessboard coming out of antiquity with the way the pieces were on the board when these thinkers started interacting and engaging. So I think we have to do a little bit here in speaking about the intellect, speaking about the mind. Now, you almost can't go wrong by relating things in the Middle Ages back to a Platonic stream and then to an Aristotelian stream. Now, there are approximations, but they're good starting points. Not everything fits neatly into it, but many things do, and perhaps most things. And so what's the stage like when we're coming out of antiquity and into these middle periods? You have the classic sort of tension between the Platonic or the idealistic side of the fence and the Aristotelian or the empirical of the fence. Now, these are rough categories. And even in antiquity, for example, Black notes that Aristotle acknowledges the primacy of today called the noumenal. That is to say, the noumenal intellect, this unseen part of mind, human mind. It has the supremacy over what can be seen and perceived and analyzed. But as time goes on, that focus and that distinction between the parts of reality that we can see, we can detect, we can make statements about, we can test, we can do some sort of observation, and how that grows, what later becomes the scientific method, that still leaves the entire noumenal field wide open. And that is the parts of reality that are beyond us, that are beyond easy examination, beyond easy rationalization, hypothesis forming. And that's pretty substantial. And so that's what we're looking at here, is this tension. Now, in the Aristotelian idea, each of the five senses is really limited. It's really just about perceiving one quality or one dimension of reality. And my sense of sight, gives me a view onto the world I'm in. And my sense of smell gives a totally different view. I can use sight to establish things like color, dimension, distance, proximity issues. There are lots of things about that I can rely upon, which is why it's so well developed in us compared with the other senses. But if you interact with somebody, for example, who is blind, you can find that their other senses have been augmented and amplified because they have the same desire to receive the stimulation that the external world will provide, but they don't have the eyesight to do it. Now, Chuck, how could I drive on the interstate if I didn't have a sense of sight? How could I drive by taste or by touch or by smell? And that's really the limitation of the sensation organs, and even the limitation of physics and what will ultimately become to be known as science proper is such a small part of the universe that it's really breathtaking to think about. And a lot of the story of what happens in the Middle Ages is a setup for the struggle that will happen as the Middle Ages transitions into modernity. So as we move toward the time of Kant and the synthesis of the noumenal with the phenomenal, the perceptive sensation faculties, the cogitation, the thinking faculty, the faculty of mind, as it were. This is all set up, and this is all the context that our middle-aged thinkers are going to have to live in. And I wanted to ask you about that, Chuck, because what if you were one of these middle-aged thinkers and you didn't want to be in that mold and you wanted to have some sort of original thought? It seems so difficult, hard to escape these kinds of classic problems, this classic pull between the physical and the non-physical, between what we can scientifically observe and talk about and the noumenal, things that are beyond us. And yet, of course, do we want to deny, or do we want to limit ourselves from talking about the noumenal, knowing that in some sense that's where almost all the interesting aspects of reality seem to live?